All right. So this last week, which was week 5, you guys read chapters 4 and 5 on Tuesday, which is Safari and Bugtis. 6 and 7 on Wednesday, which is the Sibby Fair and the Bargain, and Chatouche, chapter 8. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So at the very beginning of, when we talk about Safari is the idea that Shabanu gets to leave her home in the desert for a little bit of time. She is going to the Sibby Fair with her dad to sell camels because that is what they do for a living. I will say, as I'm going through these papers, some of you are definitely trying to read maybe shortened versions of the story on the internet, and some of your answers are less than lacking. I've given you credit up through now, but at this point in time, unless they actually meet up with the story and not the Spark Notes or whatever else you're trying to read, I'll be counting those wrong. So I just want to throw that out there because there are definitely some questions. I actually pulled up the Spark Notes. Let's see if I can get to where it was, because one of the questions I asked about was, who are the Bugtis? And a lot of people straight quoted the Spark Notes, which said, hold on, I will find it. I got the tribes of the Bulishan used to live by robbing people in the Punjabi plains. Now they live like herders, like Shabanu's family. And so many people wrote that in such close proximity, along with knowing what the Spark Notes said. I was like, they are reading the Spark Notes, which isn't a problem for clarity, but you should also be reading the book. So just know that you should be reading or at least listening to it. So I continue on. All right, so Safari. Shabanu's getting ready to go on this journey with Daddy. Mama and Pulan and Auntie stay home. They don't get to go because women are not allowed at the Sibby Fair. It's a man's only thing. This is because of their culture. Their culture is very rich, but at the same point in time, women are secondary in their culture. Women are basically kind of second best. I hate to say that. In their culture, they are expected to cook and clean and take care of the home. They don't do business. They that's left to a man to handle and things like that. Women are expected to be married. So there's a lot of cultural differences between the United States and Pakistan. Okay. So you do need to understand the cultural difference is in the roles between men and women. Definitely, men are I'm going to handle all the problems in the household. If there is a problem between, say, two neighbors, the men are going to handle that. The wives are not going to handle that. The wives won't even be in the room when it's being handled. So, with that, you have to understand that complete cultural difference. So Shabanu's auntie, goes ahead and puts a shadar on her head and says, "Here, you can't go acting like a boy forever." And Shabanu's like, ugh, and kind of takes it off because she doesn't want to really grow up. She doesn't want to go to that next stage of her life. She realizes as she grows up and once she gets her menstrual cycle for the first time, she's going to be married off. She won't be around mommy and daddy any longer. She won't be able to play with Mithu, the camel. She worries about how he's going to grow up. She kind of is sad about losing her childhood because it's not a slow progression out of childhood like it is for you guys. Okay. You guys, excuse me for a second. I have to tell my children to be quiet. Hey, I set you up with TV shows. Sit down and watch it. I am on a meet. I apologize for that. Anyways, so Shabana really doesn't want to lose her childhood. You have a gradual entrance into adulthood for the most part. You slowly get more responsibilities as the years go on. So, for instance, at 16, you get the huge responsibility of being able to drive a car. It's a vehicle. You could kill somebody with it. That's a huge responsibility. But we don't expect you to be able to drive the car at 16, get married at 16, run your own household at 16, start to have a family at 16, be able to support yourself at 16. We don't do that. Here in our Americanized culture, we slowly roll out like adulthood. We gradually welcome you into it. And for this culture, it's kind of thrust upon them. It's like one day they're a child, and bam, 6 months later, they're an adult. And that's it. So it's really tough for the girls, especially who have to leave their homes. Boys get to stay with their mothers and their fathers and eventually know that they are expected to take care of their moms and dads as they get older and elderly, but girls know that their homes are only temporary. So Shabanu is kind of like, I don't want to wear that shadar. With that, it's the whole idea that I don't want to go to that next stage of my life. Let me be. So they go ahead and they start on their journey, and Shabanu and Daddy are singing, and they kind of end up meeting the Bugtis, which, of course, were a Palestinian tribe that essentially used to survive by robbing and thieving and that kind of stuff. But now they're more shepherds and herders, but they still kind of have that same idea. It's unfortunately, it's just one of those things like if you knew somebody who had, I don't know, stolen a bunch of stuff for years, they were just stealing and stealing. And maybe they turn over a new leaf and, they decide they're not going to do that anymore. At the same time, in the back of your mind, you may still think like, would they go and steal something though? So it's that kind of thing. It's, hey, this kid did this when they were younger, and now my item is missing 3 years later. Could it still be them? So, kind of in the back of your mind, you're wondering if the people really do change, which is kind of part of human nature. Okay. So they kind of go through and they talk about that people and the crossing of the Indus River, which is this hugely, really busy road with lots of cars and lots of noise and traffic. And this is a huge difference from what Shabanu lives on a day to day life. Her day to day life is in the Toba in the desert, with the camels and not really seeing vehicles and people and all this kind of stuff. So this crossing of the Indus Road really kind of signifies, you know, the differences there are in the world. So she's kind of like, whoa. I am flipping my notes here. Somebody also goes ahead and offers money for Guluban, the dancing camel. At which point in time, Shaban is like, oh my gosh, Daddy would sell them to the Afghan warriors who are really using camels in war. Much like you would have saw maybe horses be used during like the Civil War, the Afghanis kind of used this in wars there. Understand deserts are still really hard to traverse with a lot of vehicles, especially if the vehicles, run out of gas in the middle of the desert and things like that. And the sand can get into all the engine compartments and make it hard to kind of utilize those vehicles. So these camels are still used in warfare. So they're like, oh, Shabanu is kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he would expose Guluban, our sweetest dancing camel, to, the ideas of war and the missiles and the sounds and all that kind of stuff. And she's worried that he would get killed. So she kind of runs off and runs away. And she runs to the edge of the village, which has a wall, and she finds a garden. And the story goes, as she's been told, that there was kind of this leader, an Abbasi, that lived in this city. And he had 70 wives. Yes, 70. The fact is that people in this part of the world can have many wives. They can have as many wives as they can afford. We kind of mentioned this a while ago when we studied Egypt and how, you could have more than one wife. We talked about that. One god who had 161 kids, and we said he didn't have those all with one wife. You might have kind of remembered that a little bit. So you have to understand that in this part of the world, um, polygamy, which is the practice of having more than one wife, is perfectly legal as long as you can afford them and take care of any children in which you create with them. So you can only have as many wives and children as you can care for. Otherwise, it is considered against the law. So he goes ahead and has 70 wives, but the rumor was that he kept them in cells underneath the garden. The garden was beautiful above, but underneath, all of his wives were in basically these cells, these locked rooms. They don't necessarily describe the rooms. Like, I don't know that it was like a cinder block wall and, that kind of thing, or if it had very nice bedding and, a wash basin and things like that. It could have went either way, but they don't really describe that in the story. But it kind of gives you this shocking thought of like, how could a person have 70 wives? I mean, even I, at my age, can't fathom somebody having 70 wives and, paying for that many children and taking care of them and that kind of thing. So she slowly wanders back to camp. She finds Daddy asleep, and the next day they get up and kind of head out to the civvy fair. So, that kind of talks a little bit about that. When they're at the civvy fair, Shabanu sets up camp, and she serves chapates and tea to the people that are coming by to do business with Daddy, because Daddy has the best camels at the fair. They say that several times, that he has the best camels at the fair. And at this point in time, he's looking for the best deal on his camels. He is like, I got to sell what I got to sell because I got to pay for Poulan's wedding and I have to give her a good dowry. So they really are kind of upping the ante with his camels. And he makes a couple of smaller deals to get rid of some camels. And people want them because they're the strongest camels and the best camels. But, it's one of those things like they're still waiting for this big deal to come through. And Shabanu talks about how there's no girls at the fair. The only women at the fair are ones who are doing forbidden things inside of tents. And with that, again, another mature concept in the book, that, they would kind of go more, it would be more prostitution based, that kind of thing, the forbidden things. She also sees a cross dresser there, which she is very like shocked by. Somebody who looks like a woman but sounded like a man, and she is like totally thrown off by that. Because again, imagine how small her world is and how tiny it is. There's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio. She's in the middle of the desert with just her family and her camels. And that's how she's been raised. So, although they do wander from place to place to stay near water for the camels, they're still kind of always in a deserty area for the most part. So, these kind of images, this kind of cross dresser, definitely kind of shocks her. She's like, oh my gosh, right? But she still goes into the city fair and she buys more food for the business deals, because in this part of the world, it's customary that you sit down with people and do business deals over food, like tea and food. So, in the next chapter, it's called The Bargain, and the bargain is when Daddy sells Guluban, and he sells Guluban and several other camels to somebody that Shabanu does not want to sell Guluban to. She's afraid that he is going to take them and misuse them. Essentially, that Guluban is going to suffer and die. And Daddy has to really yell at her and basically say, Shabanu, you can't act like this. these are animals. The reason why we have these animals are for our livelihood. They are not for our pets. They are not for our friends. They are for our livelihood. This is what's going to set us up for the rest of our lives. And Shabanu is so upset at Daddy for selling Guluban that she kind of runs away and kind of gets, and not far, but runs away and kind of gets in trouble, and she's letting off steam and that kind of thing. But he sells Guluban, and the next morning after Guluban's gone and Daddy's kind of got this pile of money, more money than they've seen in years, and this is going to be enough money to not only pay for Poulan's wedding but also her dowry, and also take care of Mommy and Daddy pretty much for many many years to come. And she starts to see it clearly, even though she's saddened. While Daddy tries to cheer her up, he tries to cheer her up, and he tries to buy her something. He's like, "Well, you loved Guluban. What about something you can actually keep?" And he buys her a puppy, and they name it Sherdil. Okay. And this cute little puppy, she's not really thrilled by. She's like, I kind of like it, but yeah, I'm not thrilled by it. This is one of those questions that I gave credit for. If people said that that she liked the puppy, but in reality, she was not thrilled with that puppy. Those are the kinds of questions where if you're not reading the books, you don't actually understand the inferences behind it. If you're reading only those spark notes, um, you're not going to get the full answer. So, although I did give credit again last week on some of these answers, be more careful on your answers this week. Okay. Um, so the person who bought Guluban was called Wardek. And it's interesting that his name has war in it, because it kind of gives, in an American tonality, it kind of signifies like that war aspect. So anyways, with all this newfound money, Daddy says we have to go shopping for Poulan's wedding, and we have to go out and get some things. And one of them are some different fabrics and cloths and kind of shadars and the head coverings and all that kind of stuff. And they needed bracelets, and they needed all sorts of stuff. They needed food and meat and all sorts of stuff. So Shabana's shopping, and she's looking for some sort of head covering, and she comes up to a shop owner, and the shop owner says, "Oh, what are you looking for? What is your name?" And she says, "I am Shabanu." And he's like, "Oh my gosh." He's like, "My mother's name was Shabanu, and I've never heard that name again." And it turns out that his wife has died. They never had any children, and he has his mother's chatouche in the back of the store. And he's elderly, and he says, "You know what? I don't have a use for this. I've never had children. I don't have family. I would like to give this to you." And she can't believe it, because this chatouche is so expensive, and it's like this very fine fabric, and she's appreciating this, and she's very proud by this. And because of this chatouche, she feels a little bit more grown up. During this voyage, Shabanu has really went from more of a child, with her happy camels and singing and dancing going into the desert at the very beginning, to experiencing an extreme loss of an animal that she loved and cared for and raised. And then ending up having this new thing, this puppy she has to take care of, and still function going on. She can't just stop and cry and, kind of, you know, sulk. She still has to get things done. She still has to take care of Poulan's wedding, and get all these things. So she starts to appreciate the chatouche. Even though she misses Guluban, she also starts to like the puppy eventually, which happens in this chapter, not the previous one, when the question was asked about the puppy. Now, in the next couple of chapters that you'll be reading this week, Dowry, Nose Pegs, Shanampir, Sharma, and Desert Storm. There's some big things that are going to happen in these next couple of chapters. There's some big changes that are going to start to happen. I really want you to pay attention to the character of Sharma and her daughter Fatima. So please listen about those characters because we'll be talking about them next week. Um, they are going to be a pretty prominent point in the story. They may seem like secondary characters, and technically they are, but they're going to play a bigger role than I think you will think when you first read about them in the chapter. So, with that, definitely pay attention to those characters. They're pretty interesting characters. I'll be looking to see in questions and different things, kind of how their specific characters grow and change along with Shabanu and Pulan and their ideas about moving out of childhood. And now next week, I think it's next week, you guys, the questions that you will get will be slightly different than some of the earlier questions. Early on in the book, you don't really know enough of the backstory to answer some more in-depth questions. By this point in time, after the end of this week, you'll be halfway through the book, just a little bit over halfway through the book, and you know about these characters, and the story really starts to pick up next week. So, are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Mark says no.
Okay. All right. So then, how are you guys, for those of you who actually read the story, because if you're reading the story, it actually is kind of crazy. How are you enjoying the story? If we kind of do this like a more of a book club.
Mark is really liking it. He's already made a comment about it before when you were talking. He said that the story is interesting and it has many twists and turns and that he just loves it in general.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it does. And the thing is, and one of the reasons why I asked you guys to be mature in the content is because obviously you can see they're talking about, the women doing the forbidden things in the tents. So like the prostitution. They don't say prostitution. They say forbidden things. They're very careful on how they word things. They talk about how you are married off. They're talking about the loss of something. That's one of the reasons during week 1, I asked you about your losses so that you can kind of see and remember how that felt. As we move forth, because losing anything that we care about is really, really, really tough to deal with. So any other thoughts on your character, on any of it? Otherwise, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. What do you guys think about the role of like Shabanu and Pulan in this culture? Um, as far as being girls that have to be married off as soon as their period starts. Within a couple months after they start their periods, they get married off to their husbands for life. What do you guys think about that? Think it's totally normal? Kind of crazy? Can't imagine going through it yourself? Kind of sucks. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I noticed that Bryce answered that, and understand that the boys are just as young. It's not like the boys are all that much older than the girls. I mean, it's definitely different. I saw Mark said something.
Mark says their roles are bad because they have to get married off and they can't live by themselves.
They can't. You are looked very down upon in this society if you live on your own. If you are a woman who has like divorced or left their husband, honestly, everybody looks at you and goes, "What did you do wrong?" I can't even fathom that in the culture that we have here today. And I'm sure each and every one of you knows somebody who has been divorced or whatnot. I do, for sure. And nobody's bad just because they got a divorce. That doesn't mean that they're a bad person, or that honestly, excuse me, honestly, that the female always did everything wrong. Sometimes you just grow apart. Sometimes it is one person's fault. Sometimes it is. But in this society, it is frequently blamed on the female, and the female is looked down upon as to what is wrong with you.
Yeah, and Ariana touched on that. She said it's kind of sexist.
Oh, yes, it is. Oh, Ariana, we haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg on sexism in this book yet. Oh, you keep reading, girlfriend. Well, listening, because you guys can't read. I really wish they had like a book portion of this, like somewhere free online, but they don't. I've had a couple of kids ask, and I'm like, there is nothing free online for this book. It actually came from the woman who wrote this. It came from Glencoe Literature Library, which is actually a textbook company for our middle school grades. But the woman who wrote this went to Pakistan and had stayed there for several, I want to say several years. It was like 2 or 3 years. And I know that's not 7 years, it's several years. And has observed the lives of families. This is not an actual story of one family specifically. What she did was kind of blend in the stories of several families that she ran across and met, where she was like, I can't believe women go through this in this day and age. Now, understand, this was written in the early 2000s. It was like 2002 or something like that. So it's about 20 years old at this point in time. But even in the early 2000s, girls, this kind of stuff didn't happen. It's not like I was getting married off at 13 in the year 2000. Nay, nay, my friend. I don't know where the remote is. You know, e-learning at home. What can I say? So yeah, it's very sexist, and just wait, Ariana. There's some big things coming. Any other thoughts as we read? One of the things that they're going to also talk about is the places and areas that rituals are done in. Like they already mentioned a mosque in here, that she prayed at the mosque one morning after she like ran away and saw the garden, I want to say. And then the next day she prayed at the mosque. We know that Muslims pray 5 times a day. It's one of the reasons why we study our religion aspect first, and then we go into these kind of stories, because you really can't, you're like, oh yeah, they have to do that. But they actually start talking about actual real places. Some of the places that you'll hear about in the book, you could actually look up online and see the pictures of. You'll notice when you're reading, you know that how it has like that one picture up on the screen kind of as you're reading? Those are pictures to relate back to what you're hearing about in the story. So as you look, you can kind of relate to that. At one point in time, as we go forward in the chapters, it hasn't happened yet, but they're going to mention Mecca, which is the holy city for Muslims, where people have to pray, face to pray, things like that. So they're going to talk about making a pilgrimage, which is that religious voyage. Remember, we said everybody has to go to Mecca at some point in time in their life if they're Muslim and they're able and wealthy enough to do that. So these are things that are coming up in the story. You'll be able to use your previous knowledge to kind of really understand it a little bit better. I'm wondering, let's see. I'm looking at my notes, just making sure I didn't like really miss anything. Come here, Cooper. Cooper, come. Cooper. Maybe they want to see who ran away yesterday. That was not fun. My dog's just looking at me like, yeah, whatever. But anyways, but yeah, I think we're good. Are there any other questions? Anything?
I'm getting a nope.
No? Yeah. Alrighty. Well, I'm glad you guys are enjoying the book. Definitely. Remember to kind of keep a couple of notes here and there. Again, I'm not asking you to take 10 pages of notes. That would be a waste. I'm not. Don't do that. But just kind of keep track of a couple of the main things that are happening. You want to know who some of the main characters are. Obviously, I mentioned Sharma and Fatima. You'd want to add those into your notes. You should already have like Pulan and Shabanu. No, obviously, mommy and daddy. I mean, I think that's kind of like an auntie. I think those are pretty like self explanatory, but you don't want to screw up Pulan and Shabanu. That would be bad. Um, and then Fatima that's coming up. You want to talk about some of the big issues, like for instance, Shabana losing her camel, or how she got Mithu from the camel who got bit by the snake, and she bottle fed Mithu. Um, she kind of is going to maybe look at Mithu as a replacement for Guluban, as she gets back. Because remember, they didn't take Mithu to the Civi Fair; he was too little to sell. So, and they left Tipu and some of the other females back at the Toba, um, so that they could continue to have camels to raise and sell. So, yeah. Hmm. All right. Well, I don't have anything else for you. That's about 30 minutes. So, just to kind of summarize the book and touch base and that kind of stuff. Again, do make sure that you're listening and reading to the book, and not just reading, trying to pull out answers from the sharp notes or whatever other notes are online, because my grading will get a little bit more sharper and the activities get a little bit more in depth now. Well, next week, more in depth.